Alright, so my project, along with Juan and Daniel's, was on America's military and diplomatic involvement in World War One, which lasted from 1914 to 1918. At least that was America's involvement in it. Um, let's go ahead and start with the timeline. So these are the events that we'll be covering today. There's a total of 11. Try to get through them quick. You know the gist. Alright, so the first year that there was actually major events was 1915. Before that, it was really just sending resources, just the simple stuff the Allies do during a war. So the major event that happened in 1915 was the RMS Lusitania was sunk by German U-boats, which was a submarine made by Germany. And about a little over 1,900 people were on it. Of those, 1,200 people died, and of those 1,200 people, over 120 of them were Americans. And this was a big deal because not only were they Americans, but they were civilians, and that's a big no-no in war. Um, and this was a major factor for the entrance into World War One for America, because killing civilians not okay, and it sparked a turning point from quote unquote gentlemanly war practices into a more vicious era of total warfare. Like gassing people, that type of stuff. Sorry. We're gonna go ahead and move on to 1916. Not very many things happened in this either. One of those things that happened was the Lafayette Escadrille was established, which was an Air Force unit in the French military, but it was mostly populated with Americans. And this was a very good way for Americans who wanted to fight in the war could. It basically allowed them to before they had a chance for, like, before America had formally joined it. So gave them an opportunity to do it even if their home country wasn't fighting for it. And then there were units like this is not anything special. There were tons of units like this in other allies of the U.S., like Italy, Great Britain, things like that. The last major thing that happened in 1916 for World War One was the re-election of President Woodrow Wilson. The funny thing about this guy is his slogan for his second term was "He kept us out of war." Literally 5 months after being elected, he decided to declare war. So, but he says that he joined the war because of Germany's aggressive and unrelenting wartime tactics in 1917, and these left him no choice other than to join the war. So, and this solidified our military leadership. It made it so, we weren't changing leaders in the middle of a war or right before a war or, anything Vietnamish. We just don't want that. And we're good. Yep. Alright, 1917, this is when the juicy stuff starts happening. US actually declares war on Germany. Now, before this, the US had already, cut ties with Germany, said that's a big no-no to what they were doing. But this was, the official, diplomatic, formal, I hate you, I'm gonna fight you type of stuff. The reasons for the declaration of war was that Germany violated a pledge to not engage in unrestricted warfare. And not only that, but they attempted to bring Mexico into alliance with themselves and to cause a war with us, the US, so that we could not fight Germany in their war. This was a big turning point for America and the world because it showed the U.S. as a world powerhouse, mitochondria of the world. And this extended the political control over other countries for the U.S. And it also drove for expansion of political control over the world. Kind of scummy sounding, but it's pretty important. And this, and originally U.S. kind of stick to itself. It was trying to deal with internal stuff, you know, get powerful, get its economy strong, not be in debt. Before dealing with especially European problems, but this was like one of the first times it kind of shied away from leaving everything alone. So it was actually really important because it kind of put us on the world stage, showed what we can do. All right. And so another thing that happened in 1917 was us sending a ton of troops to France to help on the front lines against Germany. We sent about 14,000 of them to this town in France, and they were led by U.S. General John J. Pershing. And the resources were backed up by the U.S. economic growth. So our economy boomed during this because we were able to industrialize, you know, make a ton of guns, make a ton of bullets, make a ton of war machines, and basically sell it to people. And that basically our economic growth has basically happened in all of the major wars that we are in. The big takeaway: wars are a good time for economic growth. Okay. And basically, this industrialization and economic growth allowed for international military support from the U.S. to other countries. Yep, and this is a picture of all the troops that we sent. It's just a picture of the troops. Alright, now it's time for the U.S. Declares War Part 2, where they actually declare war on the reason why we're having this war, which was Austria. Screw them, they're lame. And the fighting between the U.S. and Germany led to the U.S. finally declaring war on Austria, because they're kind of useless in the war. I'm not gonna lie, they're overshadowed by Germany, even though they're the reason why it all started. And during this time, the U.S. continues to show that they're basically a friggin' beast, you know, showing their dominance on the world. And the U.S. economy, industrialization is at a high producing resources for the U.S. and allies. Like I was saying, war is a great time for economic growth. And global political control is strong for the U.S. because of our involvement and bringing success into the war for the Allies. Alright, now this is the big fighting war or fighting year for the US, and it's whenever we start doing massive offensives. And the first one was St. Mihiel's offensive, and it was on the St. Mihiel salient, which was the first US-led offensive in World War I. The battle was one of the first in which the U.S. Army Air Service was used in a major way, and the battle was the first in which the U.S. First Army was used in combat. The multifaceted attack was far more successful with less casualties than expected, and the battle displayed America's power and dominance to the world. And this kind of shows you what the planning and what it ended up look like during the actual war and actually fights. And those lines are the trenches, you know. The biggest one that we had, and I would say the most important one, was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and it was the largest offensive in World War I, American-led one. And it was also the one where we lost the most lives, where we lost over 26,000 American soldiers, but over 1 million were used, so not bad percentages, still very costly. And the goal of the operation was to cut off the German Second Army and cut off supplies and communication lines. So basically surround them, get a big chunk of their soldiers out of the way, weakens them a ton. We used mortars, bombardments, tanks, aircrafts, and basically all the stuff that we'd made, and just to push the Germans back from their trenches, push them back into their own territory out of France, because France is useless and they just surrender territory all the time. And the fighting wouldn't end until the armistice brought the war to a close. In 1919, this was the final year. It was all the treaties. And the peace conference, yeah, convenes in Paris. 30 nations participated, but the main ones were the United States, Great Britain, Italy, and France. They disputed over the redistribution of territory between the U.S. and the other countries. It kind of caused havoc. And Woodrow Wilson's principle of self-determination, which means the ability for a group of people to self-govern, created conflict at the conference, as what constituted a group of people was vague. And this shows all the leaders of those four powers in the conference. You know, Italy, Great Britain, and France, and U.S. And this is the thing that basically ends the war. It was the Treaty of Versailles. This is whenever Germany actually ratifies it, like just agrees to it. And they had already accepted it before the peace conference. And they accepted Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The Allies demanded compensation from Germany for the war, and despite Woodrow Wilson's objections, the Allies forced severe terms of peace on Germany, which basically led to World War II. I'm not gonna point any names. I'm not gonna point fingers. I'm not gonna say any names, but it led to World War II. And for the war to actually end, the Germany had to accept the terms of those, and they ended up doing it, and that shows the newspaper of the time when they actually did. And yeah, we just said hell no, I don't like this, and we decided to reject it. The Senate was the main force of opposition for signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the main objections was that many felt that the treaty ceded the government's ability to declare war to the League of Nations. So basically, the U.S. had thought that they lost power by basically going into the NATO. Something similar to NATO. The irreconcilables, I don't care, were those in the Senate who refused to join the League of Nations, and the reservationists were those in the Senate who were willing to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Man, what's with U.S. and just splitting apart, bro? And the U.S. did not end up ratifying it, but they did sign the Treaty of Berlin. You know, helped out. And yes, the Senate was the main reason. People were mad, and this little cartoon shows the Senate being an idiot and not understanding that's a peace treaty. I have never read the Treaty Versailles, so I don't know if it was a good idea or not, but he looks kind of stupid because he's scratching his head. Alright, well that's it. These are our sources. This is the distribution of work. I also recorded and did the timeline and did the citing, but it took it didn't take too long. Alright, have fun, y'all.